Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. If you feel fear, you should like and subscribe this channel. So, let's go. I shouldn't have agreed to stay at the old asylum. I was looking for a place to get some peace, to work without distractions. It was a small, forgotten institution on the outskirts of town, shut down for years and surrounded by tall, rusted gates. The brochure promised quiet rooms, the occasional odd creak of the floorboards, and a peaceful atmosphere for those looking to escape the noise of city life. I thought it sounded perfect. The place was a maze of crumbling walls and faded portraits. There was something haunting about it, but I shrugged it off. The air was stale and the smell of old wood and dust filled every room. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the building seemed to groan, shifting and settling like it had something it wanted to say. By nightfall, I settled into my room at the end of a long, winding corridor. It was small, with a single bed and a rickety window overlooking the overgrown garden. The lights flickered, but I figured it was just the old wiring. I sat at the desk, typing away on my laptop, trying to ignore the way the darkness seemed to seep into every corner. Then, the sound came. At first, it was faint, a tapping from somewhere down the hall. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was the old pipes or maybe just my imagination. But the tapping grew louder, rhythmic, like someone was tapping their fingers on the wall over and over again. It wasn't random, it was a pattern. I could almost make out a word. Curious and a little unnerved, I stood up and went to the door, opening it just a crack. The hallway was empty. No one was there. The only sound was the tapping, coming from a room further down the corridor. I couldn't help myself. I had to know what it was. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The tapping continued, but now it was joined by something else. Low whispers, murmurs, like a conversation just out of reach. As I neared the room at the end of the hall, the air grew colder and the whispers grew louder, more distinct. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and the light inside flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but then I saw it. On the far wall, scratched into the paint, was a message. At first, I couldn't make it out, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw the words clearly. I'm still here. I never left. A chill ran through me, and the whispers grew louder, now urgent, almost pleading. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. A figure appeared in the corner of the room, standing just outside the beam of light. It was tall, too tall, with a figure that seemed to distort the shadows. It was like the very darkness had shaped itself into a person. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would reappear. I rushed back to my room, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The tapping returned. This time, it was louder, faster, like someone was pounding on the walls. I tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't stop. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, trying to tell me something. I grabbed my phone to call the front desk, but there was no signal. I tried again. Nothing. The whispers came again. They weren't coming from the hallway anymore. They were in the room with me, echoing in my ears, though no one was there. The tapping was joined by the sound of dragging footsteps, slowly, deliberately, inching closer to the door. I turned to the corner of the room and saw the figure again. Only this time it was closer, its face now visible. But it wasn't human. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth stretched into a twisted grin. I could hear it breathing. Panicked, I shoved the dresser in front of the door and backed into the far corner. The whispers were deafening now, filling the room, making it impossible to think. My eyes darted around, and that's when I saw it. A small frayed notebook lying on the floor, just out of reach. I hadn't noticed it before. Slowly, I grabbed it. The pages were filled with scribbles, written hastily, the ink smeared and frantic. But as I flipped through them, one word stood out above all others. Help. The final page was blank, except for one sentence written in bold, sharp letters. I never left. They never let me go. That's when I understood. The asylum hadn't been abandoned. The last patient was still there, trapped in the walls, unable to leave. And now I was part of the story. The door flew open. The figure stood in the doorway, the darkness spilling from it like a flood, and it was smiling. I didn't mean to stay at the old hotel. I was just passing through a small, forgotten town and needed a place to sleep. The sun was setting, and the dark, looming hotel across from the station was the only place with lights on. It looked ancient, a crumbling relic of a time long past. But I was tired, and the idea of driving further didn't appeal to me. I walked in, the door creaking loudly as I entered. The lobby was dimly lit, with old floral wallpaper peeling from the walls. An elderly man sat at the desk, his back hunched, and his glasses thick, barely noticing me as I approached. He looked up slowly. "Room for the night?" I asked. He nodded wordlessly, handing me a key. The room was on the second floor. He didn't say much more, just waved vaguely toward the staircase. Upstairs, the hotel smelled of mildew and dust. The hallways stretched on too long, lit by flickering lights that cast unnerving shadows on the carpet. The door to my room was old, with a tarnished brass handle. I opened it, stepped inside, and froze. The room was huge, much bigger than it. Should have been for an old hotel. But what really unnerved me was the furniture. It was all covered in white sheets, as if the room hadn't been used in years. The bed had a thick layer of dust on it, and the air felt cold, even though the heating was on. I decided to make the best of it. I opened the window to let in some fresh air and sat on the bed, pulling out my phone to check emails. As I scrolled through messages, I heard a soft sound from across the room. A faint rustling, like something shifting. I looked up, my heart racing, but the room was still. Nothing had moved. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the wind or some old creak in the building's bones. But as I turned back to my phone, the sound came again, this time clearer, a slow, dragging sound, almost like something was being pulled across the floor. I stood up, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. The door was still closed. The window was open, but there was no breeze strong enough to cause this noise. I walked toward the center of the room, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. That's when I saw it. A figure, pale and still, standing just behind the bed. My breath caught in my throat. It was a person, but they were not moving. The figure was covered in a white sheet, just like the furniture. Their shape slumped as if they were lying down, but the sheets didn't fall in the usual way. I backed away, my pulse hammering. The sheet shifted and I could hear faint breathing. But there was no mistaking it. The figure wasn't human. I bolted for the door, my hand fumbling for the handle. The door wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I yanked and pushed, but it was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. The dragging sound grew louder now, closer, and I could hear something like faint whispering. A voice. I couldn't understand, muffled, but unmistakably there. Finally, the door gave way and I stumbled out into the hallway. The lights above me flickered violently, casting long, eerie shadows. I didn't care to look back, not even when I heard the door slam behind me with a deafening crash. I rushed down the stairs, my heart in my throat. The elderly man was still behind the desk, unmoving, staring at me. I ran past him, didn't say a word. The front door slammed open as I darted outside, the cold night air filling my lungs. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and even then, I could hear the faintest whisper through the wind, calling my name. I never saw the hotel again. The next time I passed through that town, it was gone. replaced with an empty lot, nothing but bare earth where it once stood. But sometimes when the wind picks up, I swear I hear the dragging sound again, just behind me, like something, or someone, is still following. I had always been fascinated by abandoned places, and when I stumbled upon a long-forgotten train station on the outskirts of town, I knew I had to explore it. The station was overgrown with ivy, the old tracks rusted and warped, but there was one particular train car at the far end of the platform that caught my attention. It was an old passenger car, its windows shattered and its paint peeling away, but there was something about it that drew me in. Something about the way it seemed to watch me, even though it was empty. I couldn't resist. I hopped onto the platform and walked toward the car. My footsteps echoed through the silence and the air felt unnaturally cold. As I reached for the doctor handle, I noticed something odd. A faint, flickering light coming from inside the car. It seemed out of place in this desolate place. I hesitated for a moment but pushed the door open anyway. The interior was dark and musty, but the light, a dim, wavering glow, came from the far end of the car. I stepped inside, the old wooden floor creaking beneath me, my heart beat louder than the silence around me. The light flickered again, and as I moved closer, I could make out a shape sitting at one of the seats. It was a figure, hunched over, its face obscured by shadows. A chill ran down my spine. Was I imagining things? I called out, but there was no response, no movement, just the faint hum of the light. Something felt wrong, but I was too curious to turn back now. I took another step forward. Suddenly, the figure moved. It didn't stand up. It simply twisted around, its head jerking at an unnatural angle to look at me. I froze. The light flickered one last time and went out, leaving the car in complete darkness. I stood there, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear the sound of something breathing, slow, labored, coming from the seat where the figure had been. Then, a voice. A whisper, so faint I almost couldn't hear it. "You shouldn't have come." My body froze. I couldn't move, couldn't even scream. The sound of breathing grew louder, faster, more desperate, and I felt the presence move closer to me, though I couldn't see it in the dark. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling as I turned on the flashlight. The beam sliced through the shadows and illuminated the seat. Empty. The figure was gone. My heart was pounding and I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't open. Panic surged through me as I yanked the handle over and over. The air grew heavier, the darkness more suffocating, and that voice, now louder, almost screeching, filled my mind. "You're not leaving." I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The train car seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows growing longer, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. And then I saw it. The figure, no longer sitting but standing at the far end of the car, watching me with hollow dark eyes. Without thinking, I forced myself toward the door again, my body moving faster than I ever thought possible. The door finally gave way with a groan, and I stumbled out into the night. I didn't look back as I ran down the platform toward my car, the sound of footsteps following too closely behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, my breath ragged, my hands still shaking. I glanced back once, just for a moment. The train car stood silent in the distance, but now the lights inside were on, shining bright as if the train had been waiting for someone else. I never went back. I don't think anyone should. I had never intended to go to the mall that night. It was supposed to be a quick stop to pick up a few things, but when I drove up, I realized the place was almost deserted. The parking lot, usually full even at night, had only a few cars scattered about. The flickering streetlights added an eerie glow to the entrance. I had no idea why I felt an unsettling chill when I stepped out of my car, but something about the mall felt off. The heavy glass doors slid open, and I was greeted by the stale air of the empty building. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound. The usual buzz of people, the chatter, the laughter, everything was gone. The escalators stood still, the empty halls stretched out like a maze. It was almost as if time had stopped. I tried to shake the feeling. After all, maybe it was just late and the place was winding down. But as I wandered deeper into the mall, something felt increasingly wrong. I passed an arcade that had been closed for years, the flashing lights still somehow buzzing behind the locked gates. A movie theater with its glass doors covered in dust. Empty store windows staring back at me with dark, hollow eyes. I reached the food court, hoping maybe I'd find someone, anything to reassure me. But there was no one. Not a single soul. Just empty tables, chairs turned over, and a long, unnerving silence. Then I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the far end of the food court. My heart raced as I slowly walked toward the sound, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, or perhaps some other stray noise. But as I turned the corner, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. At the center of the food court, under the flickering light of a single overhead lamp, stood a figure. A person, or something that looked like one, shrouded in darkness but not entirely human. The figure stood perfectly still, facing away from me. The tapping sound, it came from the figure's hands. The rhythmic drumming of fingers on the metal surface of a nearby table. I wanted to turn around, to run, but my feet were stuck to the floor. The figure shifted slightly, its head tilting to the side as if aware of my presence, and then, in a voice as cold as ice, it whispered, "You shouldn't be here." A surge of terror shot through me. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty mall as I desperately tried to find the exit. I didn't dare look back. The mall had become a labyrinth. Every hallway seemed to stretch. Further than the last, every corner I turned only led to more darkness. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, the sound of distant footsteps too. I finally spotted the exit, the large glass doors glowing faintly in the distance. I bolted toward them, adrenaline pushing me forward as I shoved the doors open. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air filling my lungs. Looking back, I saw the mall behind me. The lights were still on, but now, in the distance, I saw them. Figures, standing motionless just inside the doors, watching. They didn't move, but I knew. They were waiting for someone else. I shouldn't have gone in. I had heard the rumors, of course, about the abandoned hospital on the edge of town, the one they shut down after the fire, the one that nobody dared to go near. But curiosity, as it often does, led me there that Saturday evening. I was alone. The sun had just set and a creeping fog rolled in, thickening the air. The hospital loomed in front of me, its crumbling facade a mix of shattered windows and peeling paint. The main entrance was blocked with a rusted chain, but I found an old side door that had been left ajar. I slipped inside, the air cool and damp against my skin. The building smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. My flashlight flickered as I walked through the dark hallways. The floors creaked with every step, as if the building itself was whispering secrets from its forgotten past. I had been exploring for about an hour when I came across a large room labeled Psychiatric Ward. The door was barely hanging on, its hinges, and inside, the furniture was overturned, old beds half embedded in the floor, a scattering of abandoned medical tools and files. The room felt wrong. The air felt too still, and the silence was suffocating. I snapped a few pictures, the eerie stillness creeping into my bones. Then I heard it. A faint sound at first, like a soft shuffling coming from the far corner of the room. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I stood still, listening intently. It came again, slow, deliberate footsteps. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it clearer, louder, footsteps, dragging across the floor toward me. I turned my flashlight toward the noise, but the beam revealed only shadows and the remnants of old, rusted equipment. There was nothing there. My breath hitched and a wave of dread washed over me. I backed up slowly, my eyes darting around the room, but the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, like someone, or something, was walking toward me. I spun around, ready to flee, but the hallway I had entered from was gone. The side door was no longer there, just a wall where it had been. Panic surged through me. I was trapped. I turned back toward the room. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure, a man, dressed in a tattered hospital gown, his eyes hollow and empty, his mouth twisted into an eerie grin. His face was gaunt, skin hanging loosely from his bones. My throat went dry. I couldn't move. The figure took a step forward, its feet dragging along the floor, its grin widening. I stumbled backward, tripping over debris, but I couldn't look. Away. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into total darkness. I heard the sound of dragging footsteps, closer now, almost on top of me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The air went cold, unnaturally so, and the darkness felt thicker. I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the direction of the figure. "Get out." The whisper echoed through the room, a low hiss in the dark. I scrambled to my feet, desperate to escape, and found the door to the hallway once again, this time wide open. I didn't look back. I ran down the hall, not daring to stop. The footsteps resumed behind me, this time faster, more urgent. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, the fog now thick around me. I never went back to the hospital. I don't know what that thing was, whether it was a leftover patient or something more sinister. All I know is that it still haunts my thoughts, especially on foggy nights when I feel as if someone is watching me, waiting for me to return. And every time I hear dragging footsteps behind me, I remember that whisper, "Get out." It was past midnight when I found myself alone in the mall. I'd been working late in the security office, finishing up some paperwork when the last of the cleaning crew clocked out. The mall had closed, the lights dimmed, and the place was empty. I was used to the quiet. As a night guard, this was my routine, walking the empty halls, checking the doors, making sure everything was locked tight. But that night, something felt off. The first odd thing happened when I made my rounds on the second floor. I passed the food court, and I could have sworn I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker of motion, like someone was standing in one of the booths. I stopped, heart skipping a beat, but when I looked closer, the area was empty. I shook it off. It was probably just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But then the elevator doors opened by themselves on the far end of the hall. I stared at them for a long moment, certain I'd locked those doors hours ago. I walked toward the elevator cautiously, my boots clicking on the tile floor. No one was inside. The lights in the elevator were flickering, casting a strange, flickering shadow on the walls. I pressed the close door button, but the doors didn't move. Instead, the light in the elevator flickered even more intensely, almost like it was responding to me. Suddenly, the doors slammed shut with a force that made me jump back. My heart was pounding now. I had to make sure everything was okay. I called the security desk, but the phone line was dead. The hum of the mall's overhead lights was the only sound now, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I continued my rounds, walking down the darkened corridors. Every store was locked. Nothing was out of place. But then, in the distance, I heard something, the soft sound of footsteps. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I called out, my voice echoing. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. Just silence. I took a deep breath and decided to check the back corridors. Maybe the cleaning crew had left something behind. As I walked past the back of a clothing store, I noticed something strange. One of the mannequins in the window was positioned slightly differently, its face turned toward me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I went to adjust it, thinking it must have been shifted somehow. But as I got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The mannequin's eyes were wide open, unblinking and staring directly at me. I backed away, breathing heavily. The footsteps started again, this time faster, closer. I spun around to face the sound, but there was nothing there. The mall was completely still. Suddenly, the lights went out. The entire mall plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the blackness, but the shadows in the corners seemed to move. My pulse was racing and I could hear my own breath echoing in the silence. Then, a whisper. Faint, but unmistakable. Help. Me. It came from somewhere ahead. I hesitated, my mind racing with fear and logic. Was it the wind? Maybe it was a leftover prank from the cleaning crew. But something told me it wasn't. The whisper came again. This time, it was clearer. Help me, please. I followed the voice, each step heavy and reluctant. It led me toward the storage area, near the back of the mall, where only the dimmest of emergency lights flickered weakly. The air was cold and damp in the narrow hallway, and then I saw it. A figure, hunched over in the shadows, barely visible. I froze. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, the figure turned its head toward me. It wasn't a person. It was a mannequin. But it was moving, twitching. Its eyes were wide open and its mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin. Before I could react, the whisper echoed louder in my ears, and the mannequin lurched toward me. I bolted down the hall, my heart thundering in my chest. The mall was alive now, full of movement, full of noise. The footsteps, the whispers, everything, closing in on me. I didn't stop running until I reached the security office, slamming the door behind me. I locked it and huddled in the corner, trying to calm my breathing. The lights flickered back on, and everything was still. The phone line was working again. I called for backup, but when the other guards arrived, they found nothing. No strange figure. No mannequins. The mall was empty again. But as they checked the surveillance footage, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The cameras had captured me running, followed by an empty, twisted mannequin that had been standing perfectly still in front of the store. It's still out there, I'm sure of it. I never worked another night shift. And if you're ever walking alone in a quiet mall late at night, just remember, if you hear footsteps behind you, don't turn around. I didn't plan on going inside. I was just passing by when I saw the antique store, a small, dimly lit shop tucked between two towering modern buildings. Its faded sign read, "Curiosities and Oddities," and it seemed out of place in such a busy, bustling part of town. But something about it caught my eye. The shop was barely visible from the street, almost like it didn't want to be found. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and old wood, the dim lighting casting long shadows over strange, forgotten objects. The shelves were packed with trinkets, porcelain dolls, clocks that hadn't ticked in years, and old books with covers too worn to make out the titles. "Can I help you?" a voice called out from the back. I turned to see an old man standing behind the counter. His face was weathered, his hair gray, but his eyes were sharp, watching me as I hesitated. There was something unsettling about him, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "I'm just browsing," I said, glancing around the store. My eyes landed on a small wooden box, intricately carved with strange symbols. It stood on a shelf, tucked between two porcelain statues, and there was something about it that drew me in. "Ah, you have an eye for quality," the old man said, his voice low and raspy. "That one's special, you know." I turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "Special?" He nodded slowly. It's been in my family for generations. There's a story behind it. A warning, really. I stared at the box, feeling an odd pull toward it, like it was calling to me. What kind of warning? The old man gave a small knowing smile. Open it and you'll find out. But be warned, it comes with a price. Something about his words made my skin crawl, but I couldn't resist. I reached for the box and felt a shiver run down my spine as my fingers brushed against its surface. It was cold to the touch. Slowly, I lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing but a small, folded piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully. The words on the paper were written in a script I didn't recognize, but as I stared at them, they began to shift and change, forming letters I could read. Once you've seen it, you can never forget. I froze, feeling a cold sweat break out on my neck. The air around me felt thick, and the shop suddenly seemed much darker. I looked up at the old man, but he was no longer standing at the counter. He was gone. I quickly closed the box and tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic started to set in as I tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't open. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. The dolls. They were no longer where they had been before. Some were now staring directly at me, their eyes wide and unblinking. A loud thud echoed from the back of the store, followed by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear the footsteps getting closer, moving toward me. I backed away, feeling my breath catch in my throat. The walls seemed to close in as I turned toward the door, again. The shop was no longer quiet. It was alive with a strange hum, as if the very building itself was vibrating. Finally, I yanked the door open and stumbled out into the street, gasping for air. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face, and I didn't stop running until I was far from the shop. I glanced back once, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw the old man standing in the doorway watching me. But there was no sign of the store when I looked again. It had vanished. Just like that, as if it had never been there at all. I never went back to that part of town, but every now and then, in the quiet of the night, I swear I can still hear the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, like someone, or something, is following me. And no matter how hard I try to forget, I can't shake the feeling that I opened a door that should have stayed closed. I was traveling for business, staying at a hotel I'd never visited before. It wasn't much, just a small budget place on the edge of town. I didn't think twice when I checked in and headed to my room. The lobby smelled faintly of stale, coffee and carpet cleaner, but it was a place to sleep, nothing more. The room was small, with faded wallpaper and a single bed that creaked whenever I moved. Nothing special about it, just the usual amenities. I threw my suitcase on the bed, made a quick call to the office, and then decided to head out for dinner. That's when I noticed the mirror above the dresser. It was large, framed in dark wood, and positioned at an odd angle, almost too high. But what really caught my attention was the reflection. The room looked exactly as it should have, except for one detail. There was someone standing in the corner of the room, just behind the bed. I froze, my heart racing. The corner was empty. No one was there. But in the reflection, there they were, tall, thin, and standing perfectly still. I slowly turned to check the corner, but there was no one. Shaking my head, I chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe I was seeing things. But the feeling in my gut didn't go away. I tried to dismiss it and left. The room to eat, my mind still uneasy. When I returned later that evening, the feeling only deepened. The mirror was now reflecting something different. There was no longer just the empty corner. In the reflection, the figure was closer to the bed, standing at its foot, staring right at me. I turned to look. The corner was still empty. I swallowed, hard, my pulse quickening. There was no way it was just my mind playing tricks. Something was wrong. I backed up toward the door, my eyes glued to the mirror, but the figure didn't move. It stayed completely still, watching. It felt like I was being suffocated by its gaze, like it was waiting for me to do something, waiting for me to look away. I grabbed my things and went to the front desk. The clerk, a young woman with dark hair, barely glanced up when I explained my discomfort. "I'm sorry, sir. There's nothing we can do about room 310, she said flatly. "It's been like that for years. We've had strange occurrences." I didn't ask for details. I just grabbed my bag and left. As I walked out of the hotel, I glanced up at the windows. The lights from the room flickered once, twice, and then went out. But I could have sworn I saw something moving inside. I wasn't a fan of antiques, but when I stumbled into the shop, something pulled me in. It was tucked between two larger buildings on a busy city street. The wooden door creaked as I entered, and the smell hit me first. Old wood, leather, dust. The place was packed with items from every era. Furniture, paintings, old clocks, all stacked in layers, making the shop feel like a maze. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with graying hair, barely looked up when I walked in. His eyes were sunken, his face pale, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. I wandered through the aisles, admiring the oddities, until a large, ornate mirror caught my attention. It was placed in the back corner, half hidden behind a velvet curtain. It was beautiful, the frame intricate with designs of swirling vines and roses. The glass had a strange sheen to it, almost like it was alive, flickering in the dim light. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn to it. "Ah, you have an eye for the finer things," the shopkeeper said, suddenly appearing beside me. His voice was raspy, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. "That mirror, it's quite special. It has a history." I nodded, still staring into the mirror. The reflection didn't seem to match the room I was standing in. It was blurry, almost like it was underwater, but the shape of the room was wrong, different. Something about it felt off. Do you want to know its history?" he asked. His breath smelled faintly of rot. I turned to face him. "What do you mean? It's just a mirror." The old man chuckled, his fingers brushing the side of the frame. "Not just a mirror. This one's been here longer than you can imagine. It shows what it wants to show." "Okay," I said, my curiosity now piqued. "What does it show?" He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "It shows the truth. But be careful. Sometimes the truth isn't something you can handle." I stepped closer to the mirror, intrigued but unsure. "What's the truth?" The old man's smile was unsettling, almost too wide. "Only one way to find out." He stepped away, leaving me alone with the mirror. I hesitated for a moment, then looked back into the glass. This time, I saw something. Someone standing behind me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. My heart raced, but when I turned back to the mirror, there it was again. A figure, faint at first, but slowly becoming clearer. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes staring directly at me. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my throat. What is this? But the figure in the mirror didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, expecting the shopkeeper, but there was no one there. The air around me felt heavier, colder. My breath came out in short bursts. "Are you okay?" The shopkeeper's voice cut through the tension. He was right behind me, his eyes wide with concern, but his expression didn't quite match the tone of his voice. I don't know," I stammered. "There was someone in the mirror." The old man's face changed. His smile faded, and he looked at the mirror, his eyes narrowing. "I told you, it shows the truth." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You're seeing her now," the shopkeeper said quietly. "The woman who wanted to know too much." the woman who never left. He motioned to the mirror. She was obsessed with it, just like you. I turned, back to the mirror, my eyes widening as the figure in the glass began to move. The woman's lips parted, and she whispered something, though I couldn't make it out. Then she reached out with one pale hand, her fingers just inches from the glass. I recoiled, but the mirror. It wasn't just reflecting me anymore. It was pulling me in. The edges of the glass darkened, becoming a black void, and I felt the pressure building around me like I was being sucked into it. The woman's face grew closer, her hollow eyes widening. "Don't touch it," the shopkeeper shouted, but it was too late. I felt myself being drawn toward the mirror, my body fighting to stay away but unable to move. The room around me faded into darkness as I was pulled deeper into the reflection. The last thing I saw was her hand, reaching for mine, and then nothing. When I awoke, I was lying on the floor of the antique shop, disoriented. The mirror was gone. The old man was nowhere to be seen, and the shop was empty, as if no one had ever been there. I stood up, my heart racing, and looked around. On the far wall, I saw an empty spot where the mirror used to be, but in its place, a new reflection. Me, standing in the middle of the room, and behind me in the glass was the woman, smiling. The air was stale and heavy, filled with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic. I didn't know why I was here, but somehow I felt drawn to this place. The mall had been closed for years, an empty shell of its former self. Graffiti covered the walls, and broken windows allowed the cold wind to creep in. Yet something about it made me uneasy, something I couldn't shake off. It was just me and my camera, documenting the decay for a photography project. I pushed open the rusted front doors, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the once bustling corridors were eerily silent, the fluorescent lights flickering above me. My footsteps echoed loudly as I moved deeper into the mall, my breath coming in short bursts from the cold. The stores were gutted, their contents long since looted or destroyed. Broken mannequins lay sprawled across the floor like forgotten ghosts, and remnants of advertisements clung to the walls, peeling at the edges. But as I ventured further, I felt a strange sense of being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I turned a corner into what used to be the food court. Empty tables, chairs tipped over, and shattered glass littered the ground. The entire area felt wrong, like it was waiting for something. Or someone. I moved past the empty counters, my eyes drawn to a set of stairs leading down into a darkened lower level. Something pulled me toward it. I hesitated, but curiosity pushed me forward. I descended slowly, each step creaking under my weight. At the bottom of the stairs was a narrow hallway, dimly lit by a few flickering bulbs. The walls were covered in what looked like old photos and torn posters, but they were hard to make out in the low light. I reached for my phone to use its flashlight, my fingers trembling slightly. The beam illuminated the walls, revealing images of the mall when it was still open. Crowds of people, children eating ice cream, and families shopping. But something was wrong. The people in the photos were off. Their faces were blurry, distorted, and their eyes, wide and hollow, seemed to follow me as I moved past. I stopped. My heart skipped a beat as I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. It moved quickly, just at the edge of my vision, disappearing around a corner. I called out, my voice trembling. "Hello? Is someone here?" There was no answer, only the sound of my own breathing, shallow and quick. But then I heard it. A faint sound, barely noticeable at first, like a soft tapping. It came from behind me, echoing down the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in. My hand. The hallway was empty. "Hello?" I called again, this time my voice more frantic. My footsteps quickened as I turned to leave, but then I froze. There, at the end of the hall, stood a figure. A man. His face was covered in shadow, but I could make out the outline of his tall, thin frame. His clothes were ragged, old, like something out of a time long past. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My breath hitched, and before I could react, the man took a slow step toward me. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. Tap, tap, tap. The sound grew louder, closer. The figure didn't move, but it felt as if the air itself was closing in. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My footsteps echoed loudly, the mall suddenly feeling much bigger, more vast, as if the hallways stretched out endlessly. I reached the stairs, but as I ascended, something pulled at my feet, like invisible hands clutching at my ankles, slowing me down. I screamed and scrambled up the steps, my heart racing as I finally reached the top. The air felt thinner as I rushed back toward the entrance, but when I reached the doors, I froze. They were shut tight. The doors I had entered through just hours ago were now sealed, locked. The tapping sound grew louder, now coming from all directions, the faint footsteps echoing in the distance. I could feel the presence of something, someone just behind me. Slowly, I turned. The figure was there, closer than ever, but it wasn't just him anymore. There were others, standing in the shadows, their faces just as blurry as the ones in the photographs. They were watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. But when I finally forced myself to turn and look at the doors again, they were wide open. I didn't hesitate. I ran, not daring to look back until I was outside, gasping for air. I don't know what I saw in that mall. All I know is that the people in the photos were never gone. They were waiting, and they still are. I hate the subway. I hate the noise, the crowds, the constant feeling of being underground. But that night, I had no choice. The storm had knocked out power across the city, and the streets were flooded. The only way to get home was to take the train. The platform was nearly empty when I arrived. A few people stood around, some with their heads down, others looking at their phones. I took my usual spot against the wall, the lights flickering overhead as the air grew heavy with humidity. The train was late, which didn't surprise me. Subway delays were a normal part of life, but tonight the wait felt longer. The usual rattling of the train arrived a few minutes later, the headlights cutting through the tunnel like a ghostly glow. It screeched to a halt in front of me, and I boarded quickly, trying to avoid the stares of the few remaining passengers. The inside of the train was almost empty. Only a man sitting alone in the back, his face hidden behind a hood, and a woman near the door, her eyes darting nervously. I found a seat near the middle, watching as the train doors slid shut with an ominous hiss. The ride started as usual, jerky at first, then smooth. But then something shifted. I felt it before I heard it. A presence. Something cold brushing my skin. My breath caught. I glanced around, but no one seemed to notice. The woman near the door was staring at the floor, her hands tightly gripping the straps. The man at the back hadn't moved. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound like nails running along metal. It came from the tunnel, but the train wasn't close to a station. It was the eerie sound of something moving. Along the tracks, something that didn't belong. I tried to ignore it, but my heart began to race. The train was slowing down, but not near any station. The lights flickered again, and I noticed that the train wasn't stopping, just slowing, the air growing colder with each passing second. The scratching grew louder, closer. I stood up, ready to exit at the next stop, but then the train jerked to a sudden halt. Everything went dark. Complete silence. The air turned thick, almost suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My pulse thundered in my ears as I fumbled for my phone to turn on the flashlight. But before I could, I felt something. No, someone, standing just behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. Just the empty seats and the oppressive dark. But then I heard the whisper, so close to my ear I could feel the breath. "You shouldn't have come." I froze, unable to speak. The scratching sound was back, closer now, almost as if it were on the other side of the walls. It was so loud I could feel the vibrations. And then the train jerked again, this time with a force that almost threw me to the ground. The lights flickered back on, dim, flickering, but enough to see. And there, standing in the aisle, was the figure of a man. He was tall, his face hidden beneath a hood, but I could see his hands. They were impossibly long, with fingers that seemed to curl unnaturally. His skin was pale and his clothes hung off him like tattered rags. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, as he took a slow, deliberate step toward me. The train screeched forward again, and the lights blinked out completely. I could hear breathing, now, slow and deliberate, not my own. The man was close, too close. Then the train lurched to a stop and the lights flickered on once more. I blinked, disoriented, but the man was gone. There was no sign of him. The other passengers remained frozen, staring ahead, oblivious to the horror that had just occurred. The doors opened. I didn't hesitate. I ran off the train onto the platform, my legs shaking with every step. The train doors closed behind me and the train left without a sound. I looked down the tracks, my chest tight with fear. The platform was empty. The woman who had been near the door was gone. The man in the back, he was gone too. And then I saw it. A faint figure in the distance, moving slowly along the tracks. Not walking, but crawling, dragging itself across the rails. The same long, impossibly thin fingers. The same hooded face, too dark to make out. It was looking directly at me. I ran, sprinting up the stairs to the street level. I didn't stop until I was out in the rain, breathless, my heart pounding in my throat. I never took the subway again after that night, but sometimes late at night I swear I can hear it. The sound of scratching, the whisper of a voice just behind me, and the feeling of something watching from the shadows. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just a quick tour through an old abandoned hospital for some urban exploration. I had seen plenty of decaying buildings before, but something about this one felt different. The hospital had been closed for years, but it wasn't until I saw it from the outside that I realized how far it had fallen into neglect. The exterior was covered in grime, windows shattered or boarded up. The entryway had been left ajar, and despite the eerie feeling that crept up my spine, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled thick, dust, mold, something rotting in the walls. I flicked on my flashlight and began moving down the dark hallway. The walls were lined with faded photographs and old medical equipment that had been left to rust. The sound of my footsteps echoed eerily in the empty building. I could hear the faint hum of something behind me. A machine? Or just the wind blowing through the cracks in the walls? I turned the corner and stepped into what looked like an old patient room. There were beds, abandoned and stripped of anything useful. One bed, though, caught my attention. It was unusually pristine, as if untouched by time. I approached it cautiously, wondering why it looked so well maintained while the rest of the room had crumbled. Then I saw it, a figure in the bed, pale, gaunt, wearing an old hospital gown. I froze, my heart pounding. Was it a mannequin? Someone playing a prank? I moved closer, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure was still, eerily still, but there was something wrong with it. The skin was too pale, almost translucent. I reached out to touch it, but as my hand hovered above the figure, a low, rasping breath echoed from the bed. I jerked back, stumbling over my feet. The figure's eyes opened, empty, dark pits of nothing, and it sat up, too fast, too unnaturally. Its lips parted to reveal sharp, yellowed teeth, and it smiled at me, a twisted, grotesque grin. I bolted. The halls seemed to stretch endlessly as I ran, the sound of heavy footsteps following behind me. I could hear it, whatever it was, scraping along the floor, dragging itself, always just a few steps behind. My breath came in ragged gasps, my feet pounding against the old tiles, but it was getting closer. I reached a stairwell and hurried down, desperate to escape. But when I hit the bottom, the doors were locked. The flashlight flickered. In the darkness, I could hear it, the slow, deliberate scraping on the floor, like claws dragging through the dust. I turned and saw it. The figure was standing in the doorway, grinning, its mouth hanging open wider than any human's should, but its eyes, they weren't just dark, they were hollow. The thing wasn't human anymore. I backed away, heart racing. I had to find a way out. Then, through the door at the far end of the hallway, I saw a faint light, another exit. I made a break for it, slamming my shoulder into the door to force. It opened. The figure didn't follow. Instead, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. The door slowly creaked shut behind me with an awful, deliberate finality. I ran outside and didn't stop until I was far, far away from the hospital, gasping for air. The night had never seemed so cold. When I looked back, the building stood silent in the distance, but something inside me knew that I hadn't escaped. I could still hear it in my head, that rasping breath, the smile, the teeth, and most terrifying of all, I realized I could hear it, still scraping at the walls of my mind. I wasn't supposed to be in the tunnels. I knew that. But when I heard about the old forgotten underground system beneath the city, those long-abandoned train tunnels I'd read about, I couldn't help myself. The intrigue got to me. It was a place no one had ventured in years, a crumbling labyrinth buried deep beneath the streets where no one would notice if something went wrong. I found the entrance behind a decrepit building, hidden by piles of rotting debris and old, rusted, yew gates. The air was damp, thick with the musty smell of decay. I flicked on my flashlight and descended into the darkness, the walls of the tunnel stretching around me like a hollow maw. The first few minutes were uneventful. The tunnel was narrow, only wide enough for me to walk through single file. Graffiti and old posters from decades ago lined the walls, some fading so badly I could barely make out the words. My footsteps echoed strangely in the silence, adding to the eerie feeling that settled over me. Then I heard it, a distant sound, a scraping noise like something dragging along the floor. I froze. It came from farther down the tunnel, too far to see, but close enough to send a chill down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I kept going. Curiosity had already pulled me in too deep. The scraping stopped, but then I heard something else, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was like footsteps, but uneven, almost hesitant. Someone else was down here. I swallowed hard, my flashlight trembling as I scanned the tunnel ahead. There was no one in sight, only the endless, empty passage stretching in front of me. I turned another corner and stumbled upon an old, decaying train car. Its door was ajar, a dark, gaping hole where the glass used to be. The inside was black. No light, no movement. But something felt off. I didn't want to go near it, but I couldn't resist. I had to know. As I approached, the tapping started again, louder this time, closer. I felt my heartbeat in my throat, but I forced myself to take another step. That's when I saw it, a figure, a silhouette, barely visible in the darkness of the train car, standing motionless. It was as if it was waiting for me. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking, but the figure didn't move. No answer. I took another step closer, my hand gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. That's when the figure moved. It was quick, too quick, more like a blur than anything else. In an instant, it was gone. I froze, my body frozen with dread. The tapping had stopped. The silence returned. Then I heard something else, a soft voice whispering, but not from the train car. No, it came from behind me. Go back. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the same dark tunnel stretching behind me. My breath caught in my throat. It had been so quiet just moments ago. What was down here? The voice came again, louder this time, almost a growl. Go back. I turned and ran. My heart was pounding as I bolted through the tunnels, the beam of my flashlight bouncing erratically. The scraping and tapping noises began again, closer, faster. Something was chasing me, something that didn't belong in the shadows. I didn't dare look back. I barely noticed the dark corners I was passing, the way the walls seemed to narrow, the smell of damp concrete growing stronger, the cold air pressing in from every direction. I didn't care. I just ran. I reached the entrance, finally, but as I tried to push the gate open, it wouldn't budge. The lock was rusted, the metal cold beneath my fingers. The noises behind me were getting louder, and that voice, screeching, whispering, was now a continuous howl. I struggled, pulling at the gate, desperation clawing at my chest. It finally gave way, just enough for me to squeeze through. But as I stumbled out, I felt something brush against my back. I didn't look. I didn't want to. I burst into the street, gasping for air, shaking. I didn't stop running until I was back in the safety of my apartment, my heartbeat still racing, the noises from the tunnels still echoing in my ears. I never went back. But the worst part? I still hear the tapping sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet. And when I close my eyes, I can feel the cold breath of something waiting in the dark. It was a rainy evening when I got stuck in the subway. The last train had left and I missed it by minutes. I wasn't thrilled about being stranded, but I figured I'd wait it out. The station was deserted except for a few stragglers. The flickering. Overhead, lights cast long shadows against the cracked tiles of the walls. The sound of the rain beating against the windows echoed through the empty platform, adding to the growing sense of unease. I sat on a bench, scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the occasional creaks and groans of the abandoned station. After a while, I began to feel watched. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I glanced around. There was no one else in sight, but something felt wrong. Then I heard it, the soft scrape of shoes on the platform, faint but unmistakable. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. It was impossible. Everyone had left. There was no one else here. But the sound came again, slowly. A shuffling, dragging noise like someone was limping toward me. I turned toward the sound and froze. From the dim light, a figure emerged. A man, his face hidden beneath a hood, his shoulders hunched as if in pain. He moved toward me with an odd, jerking gait, his steps slow but deliberate. I should have run. I knew I should have, but I was paralyzed. My mind screamed for me to move, but my body refused. I didn't speak. I couldn't. He was too close now. The man stopped just a few feet away. His breathing was labored, ragged. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his presence, the weight of it hanging in the stale air between us. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. Then he raised his hand, pointing at me with trembling fingers. "Help me," he rasped, the voice barely audible. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, the lights above us flickered violently and went out, plunging the station into complete darkness. I flinched, my heart hammering in my chest. My phone screen was the only light now, but it barely illuminated the space around me. Then I heard it, a sound so faint I almost missed it. The same dragging footsteps, but now they were coming from every direction. There was no way for someone to move that fast, yet the sounds echoed all around. as if multiple people were circling me. The man's voice broke through the growing chaos. "You shouldn't have stayed." I spun around, trying to make sense of the noises. It felt like the shadows themselves were shifting, like something unseen was watching, waiting. My legs finally moved and I stumbled toward the stairwell. The dragging steps followed me, growing louder, faster. I burst through the door leading up to the street and into the pouring rain, gasping for breath. The station's lights flickered on again behind me, like nothing had ever happened. My shoes splashed through the puddles, but I couldn't bring myself to look back. The air felt wrong. Later that night, I learned that the man I'd seen, heard, had been dead for years. They said he was a former station worker who had been found murdered at the platform after his shift. They never caught who did it. I don't know what I saw that night, but the dragging sound still echoes in my mind. It's louder every time I take the subway, and sometimes when I'm waiting alone, I swear I can hear someone limping behind me. I didn't mean to get lost. The old mall had been closed for years, but my friends and I decided to sneak in. There were rumors about it. Some said it was haunted, others claimed it was just full of old junk. Either way, it seemed like an adventure. The Desonnet Mall was on the edge of town, an empty giant now, with boarded-up windows and faded neon lights that still flickered occasionally. We knew the back entrance was always unlocked, so we squeezed through, making sure we weren't seen. Inside, the air smelled musty, thick with dust. The escalators were still, frozen in time. Most of the shops were stripped bare, but here and there, old mannequins stood in windows, covered in cobwebs, their eyes lifeless and strange. It felt wrong from the moment we stepped in, like the air itself was too heavy, too still. We tried to joke about it, wandering through the abandoned food court, peering into empty stores. The silence was so absolute it made my skin crawl. That's when I heard it. A faint noise, like footsteps echoing, from somewhere deeper in the mall. I froze, looking at my friends. They didn't seem to hear it. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling that someone else was here. After all, the mall had been closed for years, right? "Maybe it's just the wind," one of my friends said, her voice breaking the silence. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, and then a door slammed. I turned, eyes wide, and pointed toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" My friends nodded, their faces pale. We started moving toward the sound, against our better judgment. We walked through the dark, empty hallways, past old clothing racks and broken glass. The air seemed to grow colder the further we went. Finally, we came to the source. A door, partially ajar, leading into what looked like an old storage room. The footsteps had stopped. Everything was still. I hesitated, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I pulled open the door and stepped inside. The room was filled with dust, boxes stacked high. Nothing unusual at first glance, but then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, there was a mannequin, strangely out of place, standing tall under the dim light. But this one was different. It wasn't covered in dust, and it wasn't in the same position as the others we'd seen around the mall. It was facing the wall, almost like it was waiting for us. A sudden, piercing chill ran through me, and I turned to my friends. "Let's go," I said, my voice shaking. But when I looked back at the mannequin, it wasn't facing the wall anymore. It was staring directly at me. My blood ran cold. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The mannequin blinked. I stumbled, falling backward, and the others screamed. We ran, not daring to look back. We ran through the mall, past the dead shops, down the hallways we thought we knew. But when we reached the exit, it wasn't there. The door was gone. I could feel the panic setting in. My friends and I pounded on the walls, screamed for help, but it was as if the mall had swallowed us whole. I turned, and the mannequin from the storage room was standing there in the middle of the hallway, its head tilted slightly as if it had been waiting for us all along. And then the lights flickered, once, twice before plunging us into complete darkness. We were surrounded by nothing but silence and the sound of our breathing. Suddenly, we heard something else. A faint whisper, like someone calling our names, but there was no one around. We ran again. We didn't stop until we found the entrance we'd used earlier, but it wasn't open. It was a wall. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. I lost track of time. All we could do was scream and run. The footsteps were always behind us, always following. When we finally found an exit that led outside, we didn't stop running until we reached the safety of our cars. We didn't speak a word to each other as we drove away from the mall, the headlights cutting through the darkness. None of us have been back since. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I hear it. The sound of footsteps behind me, the whisper of a mannequin's gaze, and I know that the mall is still waiting. I never thought I'd end up in the desert. My friends and I had been looking for an adventure, something off the beaten path, so when one of them found a cheap cabin for rent in the middle of nowhere, we jumped at the chance. The drive was long, and by the time we finally reached the cabin, the sun had already begun to set, painting the sand dunes in dark shades of orange and red. The cabin was small but sturdy, tucked away among the rolling dunes, and we figured it would be the perfect place to escape. No phones, no distractions, just us, the stars, and the vast desert surrounding us. The air was still, and the only sound was the faint hum of wind in the distance. We settled in, unpacking and laughing as we cracked open beers and made dinner. By the time night fully arrived, we were outside, sitting around a small fire, our faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The desert was dead silent except for the occasional rustle of wind and the distant screech of an owl. It was peaceful. But then, around midnight, something strange happened. We all heard it at the same time. Soft footsteps in the sand. At first, we thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. But the footsteps were too distinct, too purposeful. They sounded close, like someone was walking just beyond the light of the fire, yet when we looked, there was nothing. I stood up, trying to brush off the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. "It's probably just a coyote or something," I said, my voice betraying my own doubt. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled around the fire, moving in a way that didn't seem natural, too rhythmic, too deliberate. "Are you guys hearing this?" Mark asked, his voice shaky. We all nodded. We had to. The fire seemed to flicker and fade as though something was draining the light. The air turned colder, and we instinctively huddled together, our eyes scanning the edges of the light where shadows grew long and threatening. The footsteps stopped. Then, out of nowhere, the ground beneath us trembled, just slightly. It wasn't an earthquake, more like the heavy weight of something approaching. And then we heard it. A low whisper, almost like a voice carried on the wind, but it wasn't clear enough to understand. I glanced at my friends, their faces pale. None of us spoke. We all just stared into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Leave." The whisper was so faint, so distant, that I almost convinced myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But when we heard it again, this time closer, almost directly behind us, we froze. "Leave. Now." I snapped my head around, but no one was there. I could see the desert stretching endlessly, the sand rolling across the ground in soft, undulating waves. There was nothing out there. Nothing but the still night and the growing sense of dread that clawed at the edges of my mind. "We need to go," Sarah said urgently, her eyes wide with panic. But as we stood to leave, the sand around the cabin seemed to shift, as if something was emerging from the earth. The air became thick, and the temperature dropped sharply, the cold seeping into our bones. The fire sputtered and died. We all rushed for the door, but as I reached for the handle, a figure appeared in the doorway, blocking our exit. It was a man. Tall, gaunt, his face obscured by a dark hood. His hands were covered in sand, as if they had been buried beneath the earth itself. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The feeling of suffocating terror that gripped us was enough. I pulled the door open and shoved past him, my heart racing as I bolted into the desert. My friends were already running, our footsteps sinking into the sand behind us as the wind howled louder, as though it were chasing us. We didn't stop until we reached the car, throwing ourselves into the seats, desperately starting the engine. The moment the headlights flicked on, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. We never spoke about what happened after that night. We drove back to town in silence, our minds racing, our bodies trembling. But I know one thing for sure. Something was waiting for us in that desert, something that wanted us to stay. And whatever it wasn't finished with us. I never expected a simple detour to turn into something so terrifying. It was a weekend road trip with some friends, and we had decided to take a back route to avoid the traffic. The GPS guided us down an isolated path, surrounded by fields on either side. We passed small farms and old barns, but then we reached something strange. A rusted, abandoned train station. It looked out of place. No one seemed to be around, just this crumbling relic in the middle of nowhere. The station itself was nothing more than a half-rotted platform with an old, decaying train on the tracks beside it. The air felt heavy, like it didn't belong in the time it was in, as if the place had been frozen in time. I convinced my friends to stop and explore it, despite the discomfort creeping over me. We stepped off the car and onto the platform. The air smelled musty, like old wood and forgotten metal. There was a strange feeling here, like someone or something was watching us. The train itself was still, dark, and ominous. Its windows were shattered, and graffiti covered every visible surface. One of my friends, Mark, joked about how it looked like a ghost train, abandoned for years. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows. "Let's take a look inside," I said, already regretting it. But curiosity pushed me forward, and my friends followed. We climbed onto the train, careful not to step on broken glass or rusted metal. Inside, it was worse. The seats were rotting, and the remnants of old luggage scattered the floors. But what caught my attention was the sound. A faint clicking noise like the sound of a train moving down the tracks, except the train wasn't moving. It was stationary. I turned to Mark, and he seemed to have heard it too. "You hear that?" he asked. Before anyone could respond, a cold wind blew through the broken windows, rattling the loose panes of glass. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, the sound of someone walking down the hallway of the train. My heart dropped. We hadn't seen anyone approach, and the train was too far from civilization for anyone to be here. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. The footsteps stopped. We tried to laugh it off as the wind, or maybe some animals outside, but the feeling in the air was thick, suffocating. Then I saw it, just for a second, through a cracked window. A figure, tall, hunched, wearing what looked like an old conductor's uniform, but completely out of place, like it had been there for decades, frozen in time. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The figure vanished just as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me standing there, paralyzed. My friends were still looking around, oblivious to the terrifying sight I'd just witnessed. Suddenly, the train jerked. The sound of grinding metal echoed through the car as if the train had just started to move. We rushed to the door, trying to get off, but the train wasn't stationary anymore. It was moving, slowly at first, but the clicking sound grew louder and faster, like the train was gaining speed. I pushed and pulled at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Mark was at the window, staring outside with wide eyes. "There's someone on the platform," he whispered. I turned to look, and my stomach turned cold. A man stood there, just standing in the middle of the tracks, watching us. He was dressed like a conductor, but his face was shadowed, his eyes barely visible. Then, everything stopped. The train lurched to a halt. throwing us all forward. The clicking noise ceased and the door finally opened with a creak. Without a second thought, we ran out of the train, scrambling back onto the platform. We didn't look back. We didn't care if the train was real or if we had imagined everything. The feeling of being watched stayed with us as we hurried back to the car. As I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, I thought I saw the silhouette of the conductor, standing in the doorway of the train, just staring. We drove away quickly, not speaking a word, but none of us ever forgot that night. I still don't know if it was a ghost train or something worse, but I can never pass by that station again, even in daylight. And whenever I hear the sound of clicking tracks, I know it's not just a train. It's something else, waiting. It was an ordinary Tuesday when my friends and I decided to break into the old abandoned mall on the edge of town. The building had been empty for years, ever since the fire, but rumors still lingered. People said the mall wasn't just abandoned, it was haunted. Doors that opened by themselves, strange sounds in the night, and lights that flickered even when the electricity had been cut. We weren't ones to believe in ghost stories, so we grabbed our flashlights, climbed through a broken window, and stepped into the darkened halls. The air inside smelled musty, like old carpet and decay. The large glass windows had been shattered, leaving behind jagged shards, and the walls were covered in peeling paint. We weren't exactly quiet, laughing and joking as we wandered deeper into the dark, forgotten corridors. The distant sound of dripping water echoed, and we made our way toward the food court, the heart of the mall. When we reached the center, something was off. The chairs at the food court tables were overturned, and a chill ran through me as the silence enveloped us. Then, the first thing happened, a distant thud, like a door slamming shut. We froze, our breath catching. I turned to my friends, but they just shrugged, trying to laugh it off. "We're fine," Alex said. "It's just the building settling." But the air had changed. It felt heavier now. We continued down the hall towards the old toy store. The aisles were filled with dust and old, rusted shelves lined the walls, but as we stepped inside, I noticed something strange. There, lying on the floor in the middle of the store, was an old, dusty teddy bear. It was positioned as if it had been carefully placed there, sitting upright, its eyes staring directly at us. "Did anyone bring that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "No. It wasn't here when we walked in," Sarah answered, a frown crossing her face. We were all uneasy now. The silence was deafening, and no matter how hard we tried to shake off the feeling, something didn't feel right. As we moved toward the back of the store, the lights flickered. I glanced up, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the corner of my eye, something that wasn't one of us. I wasn't sure who screamed first, but suddenly a loud crash echoed from somewhere above us, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that weren't ours. We bolted, running back down the hallway, past the old escalators, but the further we went, the more distorted the sound seemed. The footsteps were following us, coming closer with every step. When we reached the exit, I yanked at the door, but it was stuck. I pulled harder, but it didn't budge. I turned to see the others behind me, their faces pale with fear. The footsteps were louder now, just outside the door. Then we heard a voice, a soft whisper, almost drowned out by the rushing sound of our heartbeat. "It's too late to leave." I slammed against the door again, but it didn't open. We could hear the footsteps stop, and for a moment, all was still. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hallway, bathed in the dim light of a flickering bulb. The figure was tall, dressed in black, and just as I thought it was moving toward us, it vanished. In that instant, the door burst open. Without thinking, we ran, not caring where we went, just knowing we needed to get out. We sprinted through the parking lot, hearts racing, not stopping until we reached the street. We didn't speak a word to each other as we climbed into the car. As I glanced back at the mall in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw one of the windows flicker with light. But there was no one there. None of us ever went back to that mall, and to this day, we don't speak of what happened that night. We don't need to. We know what we heard, what we felt. And sometimes, when the wind is quiet, I swear I can still hear those footsteps behind me. I was a thrill seeker, always looking for new, exciting places to explore. So, when I heard about the abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town, I didn't think twice. The rumors were hard to ignore. Some said it had been shut down due to accidents, others claimed it was cursed, but I was determined to see it for myself. I arrived at sunset, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The park's iron gates were rusted, but still standing, creaking in the wind as I pushed them open. The air was thick, carrying the smell of old popcorn and mildew. The rides, once vibrant and full of life, now loomed like skeletal remains, their bright colors faded and chipped. A Ferris wheel towered in the distance, motionless, its seats swaying slightly as if touched by invisible hands. I wasn't scared, just intrigued. I had a flashlight, a camera, and a sense of adventure. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, littered with broken glass and torn ticket stubs. I passed by the old cotton candy stand, its pink awning sagging, and heard a strange scraping sound in the distance. I paused, but it was just the wind, I told myself. I ventured further into the park, the distant sound of a carousel echoing through the stillness. The music was distorted, slow and warped, like it was being played on a broken record. It gave me an eerie feeling, but I couldn't turn back now. I'd come for a story after all. As I approached the carousel, I saw that it was empty, except for a lone horse in the center. The brass poles were tarnished, the mirrors cracked. But there was something else. Movement. The horse's eyes, dull and lifeless before, now seemed to glimmer in the dim light. I blinked. It was impossible. I turned my flashlight on it, but the horse was still. I stepped closer. The ground beneath me shifted. The lights above the carousel flickered on for a split second before snapping back into darkness. My heart skipped. The scrape I'd heard earlier came again, louder this time, accompanied by faint whispering voices. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold chill slide up my spine. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone else exploring the park with me, but there was no one. The air grew colder, the shadows around me deepened. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. I took a step back, but my foot caught on something. I looked down to see a cracked, dusty mask lying on the ground. An old clown mask. Its eyes hollow and black. As I bent to pick it up, I heard the scrape again, this time right next to me, followed by a low, guttural chuckle. I whipped around, but nothing was there. Just the empty, silent park stretching out into the darkness. I started to back away slowly, but the sound of footsteps, quickening now, came from every direction. I looked at the carousel again. The horse was no longer still. It was moving, just slightly, as if it was rocking gently in the wind. But there was no wind. The air was still too still. I could feel my pulse racing, my breath shallow. That's when I saw it. A figure standing near the Ferris wheel just at the edge of the shadows. It was tall, wearing a tattered uniform, its face hidden in the dark. The figure began to move toward me. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in the ground. The footsteps were growing louder, faster, now accompanied by the distant sounds of the carousel's warped music, echoing like a ghostly lullaby. The figure was getting closer. In one frantic motion, I turned and ran. My flashlight bobbed wildly, illuminating cracked pavement and abandoned food carts. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The footsteps were right behind me now, too close. The music, the laughter, the whispers, everything was crashing together. In my mind, a jumbled mess of fear. I reached the exit gate, but it was locked. Panicking, I yanked at the rusted bars, but they wouldn't budge. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my palms slick with sweat. The figure was now at the gate, standing just behind me. I could feel its presence like a cold weight on my shoulders. And then it spoke, its voice a whisper against my ear. "You shouldn't have come." With a surge of adrenaline, I tore away from the gate and sprinted toward the only way out, the main road. As I ran, I could hear the eerie laughter from the carousel, the warped music fading into the background. When I finally reached my car, breathless and trembling, I didn't look back. I drove away as fast as I could, the park fading into the night behind me. I haven't been back since, but I can still hear the distorted music sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just right. And every now and then, I catch a glimpse of a clown mask forgotten in the shadows just outside the corner of my eye. Some places don't want to be left behind. It was supposed to be a quick stop, a place to sleep on my road trip across the country. I'd been driving for hours and couldn't pass up the small rundown hotel off the highway. It looked old, but it was still standing. A faded neon sign hung crookedly above the door, flashing vacancy. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of cars tucked under the sparse lights. Inside, the receptionist was quiet, a man with pale skin and eyes that barely blinked. He handed me the key, wordlessly. Room 13. I'd never been superstitious, but the number made me pause. He didn't seem to notice. The room was dim, with peeling wallpaper and a smell of mildew that hit me as soon as I opened the door. The bed was unmade, sheets carelessly tossed across it. There was a strange feeling in the air, heavy, like something was waiting. I shrugged it off and decided to rest for the night. I didn't notice the first sign until I tried to shower. The water was freezing cold, no matter how much I adjusted the taps. As I stepped out of the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror, a shadow moving behind me, but when I turned around, nothing was there. I wasn't the type to get scared easily, but the room felt off. I walked over to the window and looked out at the dark parking lot. The night was eerily still. No sound except for the occasional creak of the building settling. I lay down in bed, trying to ignore the nagging feeling crawling up my spine. But then there was a soft sound, a light knock at the door. I sat up, my heart pounding. It was late, past midnight. Who could it be? Hesitant, I walked to the door and checked the peephole. Nothing. I opened the door cautiously, but the hallway was empty. Just as I was about to shut it, I heard something from down the hall, a door creaking open, followed by the faintest sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. It didn't sound like someone just passing by. It sounded like someone waiting. I closed the door, locking it, and quickly turned back to the room. But when I looked at the bed, my blood ran cold. The sheets had been rearranged. Not in a way that looked like someone had just gotten in, but in a deliberate, precise way. The covers were pulled back, as if someone had been lying there, watching me. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the window behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The blinds rattled as if something had hit them from outside. I took a step back, my breath quickening. Then the phone on the nightstand rang. I didn't want to answer it. I knew I shouldn't. But the ringing continued, sharp and insistent. Slowly, I picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was a whisper. "Leave. Now." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I dropped the phone, panic rising in my chest. I didn't hesitate this time. I grabbed my things and rushed out of the room, not even bothering to close the door behind me. The hallway was silent, the lights flickering intermittently above me. I made it to the stairs and down to the lobby, where the receptionist was still standing, motionless. Is something wrong? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He blinked slowly, the corners of his mouth curling into a smile that made my stomach turn. Room 13, he said, his voice almost a hiss. It's always been empty. You shouldn't have stayed. I didn't ask what he meant. I just turned and ran out into the cold night, not stopping until I reached my car. I never looked back, but as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I felt something following me, watching, waiting. I haven't passed through that town since. And whenever I pass a hotel with a room 13, I don't hesitate to keep driving. I'm not sure what was in that room, but whatever it was, it never left.